Welcome to another supplemental. This is my more loosely scripted series, something halfway between a podcast and a vlog. Today I wanted to talk about Star Trek and its genre, or rather, this will be me ranting about something folks say about Star Trek which I think is stupid, and loads of people are going to get angry at me for saying so. So, I wanted to talk about those folk who like to refer to Star Trek as hard sci-fi, and why I think this is not only wrong, but also kind of underserves Star Trek as a franchise and actually stops other people from getting into it. Now, genre is quite a nebulous concept in general. Science fiction as a term is an extremely broad genre. Various writers and thinkers and so on have tried to come up with a definition of science fiction, but it often excludes a lot of potential works. For example, Robert A. Heinlein, in his definition, emphasized scientific accuracy, but by doing that, he kind of excludes a lot of works that his contemporary authors were doing, and a lot of other great works are excluded by his definition. Personally, the definition I go with comes from the YouTube channel Tale Foundry. They're a really good channel which talks about literature and a bunch of other things, and they did a video about the definition of sci-fi and what I said about various people's attempts to try and define the genre, and they came up with their own definition, which I really like, and they did a really good video explaining their definition, what it means, and why it includes a lot of works which are often excluded by other people's kind of restrictive definitions of what science fiction is. Since watching Tale Foundry's video on the definition of science fiction, though, I come to think of science fiction as kind of a spectrum, where there's hard science fiction at one end and soft science fiction at the other, with anything beyond the softest of soft science fiction kind of tipping over into fantasy. And sometimes they kind of mix and mash. As I said, the genre is very nebulous, but if you think of science fiction as a spectrum of hard sci-fi being at one end and soft sci-fi being at the other end, I think we can understand why Star Trek is very much on the softer end of science fiction. Now, to explain further, I want to bring up this guy, Professor Jim Kakalius of the University of Minnesota. This guy is a really interesting dude. He was the scientific consultant for the Watchmen movie. He writes a lot about the real science of superhero comic books and other geek things. He's a really interesting guy. You should really look him up. Now, Kakalius talks about the miracle exemption in a lot of his work. So, for example, if you're writing a science fiction story and you want to have some world building where you want a certain civilization or a certain kind of spaceship or something like that, oftentimes there's a real world scientific problem that you're going to come up against. And basically the miracle exemption is the way in which you as a writer can kind of hand wave away this real problem. And basically Kakalius says, barring that one miracle exemption, does the science of a work make sense in terms of real science, in terms of, is it realistic? So, for example, if you look at The Expanse, the books or the TV show, the miracle exemption in that universe is the Epstein drive. A real-life problem in kind of long-distance space travel is the conservation of fuel and fuel efficiency. How do you get from one planet to another, which may be very, very far away, with enough fuel? Will you have to have massive, massive fuel tanks which take up like 90% of the ship's mass? And if so, how do you get back again? Will you need like an even bigger ship, and so on and so forth? So a problem which is often worked on by NASA engineers and other scientists and so on is creating more efficient fuels, which you don't need to bring as much with you, or coming up with new fuels which can be very compact and easy to use and generate a lot of power without using a lot of material. And in The Expanse, that's the Epstein drive. We have ships which are bouncing around between different planets and so on, and a big chunk of the mass of each ship is not dedicated to the fuel. There's a bit of it, obviously, but they rely on little pellets of material which they kind of ignite in a fusion reaction to generate force and so on. And that's only theoretical right now in real life science, but in The Expanse they've solved that problem. And being that they've solved that problem, that's their miracle exemption, they've got around this problem, does the science in The Expanse make sense? Does the rest of the universe make sense? And is it realistic aside from this one miracle exemption? And the answer to that is absolutely yes. The ships in the Expanse generate gravity in a very realistic way. It's called linear acceleration. Or they use gravity boots to stick themselves to the deck. There's a lot of attention paid to the different gravities people grow up in and how it atrophies their bones and weakens their muscles and so on and so forth, and how different people from different planets react to different atmospheres and so on. There's a lot of work which goes into the Expanse to make sure it is scientifically accurate and realistic. The only unrealistic stuff, or the most unrealistic stuff, is everything to do with the proto-molecule. But that kind of gets an excuse, gets a pass, because it's crazy, powerful, ancient alien technology and no one knows how it works. And in the context of the stories and of the universe, it is the violation, the exception to the rule. It violates the physics which the rest of the universe adheres to very sharply, whereas the proto-molecule kind of breaks all the rules. But that makes sense because it's crazy, powerful, ancient alien technology and no one understands how it works. So the Expanse is really built on just one miracle exemption, which is about the Epstein drive. And aside from that, the rest of it is totally scientific accurate, and there's a lot of effort which goes into the writing of that show and those books to make sure it's realistic and to make sure it all makes sense. So The Expanse is absolutely hard science fiction. And I think this is a good way to judge where a science fiction story kind of lies on the spectrum, is how many miracle exemptions are there in the story. In The Expanse, there's only really one. There is the proto-molecule stuff, but in terms of a fictional universe and world building, the Epstein drive is really the only major miracle exemption. In a show like Ronald D. Moore's Battlestar Galactica, there's three. We have the FTL drive, their jump drive, their artificial gravity, and of course they have living machines. And while it's not as hard sci-fi as The Expanse, the rest of it, broadly speaking, makes a lot of sense. They don't have pew-pew laser guns and charged particle beam weapons or anything like that. They shoot bullets and missiles and so on and nuclear weapons at each other, and they don't write on electric pads and things. They use felt-tip pens and biro pens and things like that. So while Battlestar Galactica has more miracle exemptions, it is also leaning towards harder sci-fi, whereas The Expanse is overtly hard sci-fi. Now, that brings us to Star Trek. And based on this, you may see where I'm going with this. How many miracle exemptions are in Star Trek? The answer is a lot. There is number one, the warp drive and faster than light travel in general. And before anyone actuallys me about the Alcubierre warp drive, yes, it's really cool if it turns out to work. The Alcubierre warp drive is very much theoretical at this point, and certainly wasn't around or in the popular consciousness during the 1960s when Star Trek was being created and made up and the technology was being made up. So it's purely theoretical. No one knows if it actually works yet, and no one knows if it does work, it will actually work like it does like it's portrayed in Star Trek. Star Trek also has artificial gravity, with gravity plating being used to generate gravity, and that's why their ships have decks stacked on one another, very much like modern naval ships are. There is no explanation given to how gravity plating on a Star Trek ship works. You could use the excuse and kind of say, it's gravitons or it's whatever particles, but again, gravitons aren't proven to be real. We don't know that anything like that is real. They're theoretical, but it doesn't make them real. Practically, it's not based on real science at all. There are also replicators. And again, before you actually me about 3D printers, they create objects from a plastic resin. Replicators literally deconstruct matter, the matter of an object itself, convert it into energy and then back again. That's an incredibly powerful technology which people do not have a single clue right now how to do. So no, replicators are not real. They're not based on real science. They are a miracle exemption. There's also transporters, and again, before you actually me about quantum tunneling and so on and so forth, transporters do not work. Transporters are not real in real life. No one knows how the hell the transporters in Star Trek work. In fact, GCP Grey did a really good video on Star Trek's transporters about how, based on how they work, they're probably execution machines, and that they're probably actually producing copies of people, like Tesla's machine in The Prestige. There's also phasers. And yes, while charged particle beam weapons are a thing and have been discussed, again, no one really knows if a weapon like that could really work. And so, on the Enterprise alone, there are 5 miracle exemptions. That's more than the entirety of Battlestar Galactica's universe. And that's just on the Enterprise. That's just the basic setting of Star Trek. It has 5 miracle exemptions. And again, while some of these are inspired by theoretical science, real theoretical science, none of them have been proven. And in practice, it's very likely they wouldn't work like they are portrayed working in Star Trek. Now, of course, Star Trek's technology has been explained in technical manuals and other material, but this stuff is not in the dialogue of the show. It's made up somewhere else by someone else, and then it's later reincorporated into the dialogue. But it never actually happened in the show. No one has sat down in an episode and explained step by step how a transporter system works. Mike Okuda was once asked at a convention, how does the Heisenberg compensator or the transporter work? And his response was to say, it works very well. So even the writers of Star Trek, a lot of the time don't know how the technology works and basically just make up whatever reason and contrive, some made-up material and made-up substance, like dilithium and tritanium, and they just make up whatever they need to in order to justify why the technology works. Although we have explanations, those explanations all rely on more made-up stuff, which, again, doesn't have a basis in reality. Some of it may be theoretically possible, but that doesn't make it hard science fiction, and it makes a vast majority of the technology and the technobabble and the space stuff that we see in Star Trek miracle exemptions. Star Trek basically uses its technology and so on as a workaround to get to the really interesting stuff. Star Trek ultimately is about people, and it's about societies, and it's about more interesting things, frankly, than how does the Heisenberg compensator work. For example, Star Trek's kind of monocultures and things, it's often been said that Star Trek's aliens are kind of all painted with the same brush and things, but that's a deliberate choice in that the aliens of Star Trek often represent facets of humanity. Klingons are the warrior race, and Ferengi are the greedy race, and so on. And by having stories about these aliens, it often allows the writers to examine these facets of the human race. And that makes Star Trek stories really interesting and really thought-provoking, and it's why the franchise has lasted. It's not because of its reliance on technology, and it's certainly not because Star Trek is hard science fiction. Now, while I think this categorization is a mischaracterization, what I don't like, and why I thought I should make this video, is that I don't like this miscategorization being used by snobs, frankly. There's this perception by some people that hard science fiction, something that is more realistic and more scientifically accurate, is better than soft science fiction. A lot of people bring up Star Wars versus Star Trek, and they say Star Wars isn't really sci-fi, it's space fantasy. I see where that argument is coming from, but honestly, Star Wars is really both. People bring up the Force as this mystical, magical element, which is very fantastical and very fantasy-like. But also, Star Wars features a hell of a lot of sci-fi tropes. It has spaceships and it has robots and so on, which aren't powered by magic. They're powered by electricity. And there are also lots of Star Wars technical manuals and things which go into the details of how all that's explained, with just as many made-up materials and substances and things as Star Trek has made up. Star Trek is not hard sci-fi, and even if it was, it wouldn't make it better than any other particular science fiction property. Now, a lot of people also bring up that Star Trek has inspired loads of real-life scientists. People saw it in the 60s and then they grew up and they were inspired to become scientists. And that's certainly true. But again, it's not because of long-winded technical explanations. It's not because the warp drive was realistic. The warp drive is not realistic. People were inspired by Star Trek for an emotional reason, because of the wonder, because of, seeing a ship going boldly, exploring strange new worlds and meeting strange new life, and they saw the way that advanced technology and scientific breakthroughs could transform a society. That's what's inspiring. It's not the fact files, which have a big diagram about how the transporters work. That's not what's inspiring. And I think really that's what kind of rubs me the wrong way when people miscategorize Star Trek as hard science fiction, because calling Star Trek hard science fiction, frankly, it kind of makes it sound a bit boring to a lot of people and undersells its strength to potential new Trekkies. I've always said new Star Trek fans are always a good thing. It's always nice to share something you love with another person. It's always a nice feeling when you can introduce Star Trek or something that you like to another person and have them become just as big a fan of you, and both of you can geek out about it and all that kind of stuff. And frankly, new Star Trek fans, or rather potential new Star Trek fans, won't be sold on Star Trek if it's described as hard science fiction, and if it's described by someone as technobabble heavy and with an emphasis on scientific accuracy. Because rather than expecting to sit down and be met with, thematically rich and emotional stories and character-driven stories, they'll instead expect basically to sit down and be lectured. They'll expect a scientific lecture, and they'll expect a lot of characters sitting around big blinky lights and going into detail about various systems and technology and things. There's this perception that Star Trek as a franchise is a very cold franchise. I've always said I think it says something about each franchise, with the Star Wars comparison again, that the most famous quote from the franchises like Star Wars is stuff like "May the Force be with you" or "Luke, I am your father." Whereas with Star Trek, the most famous quote that's associated with Star Trek is "Beam me up, Scotty." It's someone telling someone else to press a button, to use a gadget. There's the perception that Star Trek is an unemotional, cold franchise that, geeks only like because it's a bunch of made-up technology mumbo-jumbo. And that's just not true. And I think describing Star Trek inaccurately as hard science fiction does it a disservice, frankly. No potential Star Trek fan, no friend or family member, whoever, is going to be convinced to watch it and to get involved, or going to be convinced that they should give Star Trek a go by someone explaining to them how the warp drive works. And that's why I think calling Star Trek hard science fiction is not only inaccurate, but is generally a bad idea. Thank you for watching. If you like these videos, subscribe and hit the bell icon to stay up to date on my new uploads. If you want to help the channel grow, join my patrons or my YouTube members, where you can see videos early as well as some other exclusive content. Speaking of which, I'd like to quickly thank all of my patrons and members who are now appearing on screen. Have a good one, and as always, live long and prosper.